Hi everybody, we're back today to continue learning about Pennsylvania history, my favorite subject. So we are going to be talking today about some other prehistoric people. Last time we met, we talked about the Paleo Indians. We talked about the Ice Age and some of those events that affected things in the Ice Age. We're also going to be continuing to look at that reading skill of cause and effect today as well. So as we continue reading, keep that in your mind as well. We're looking at how one thing led to another, how one event caused another to happen, how that event then caused something else, that chain of events with cause and effect. So other prehistoric people, if you're following along with me in the ebook that I have posted in Google Classroom, we are looking at page 12. Page 12, that's chapter 1, lesson 2, and the heading here is Other Prehistoric People. The main idea states that over time, ancient people changed and learned to use the land in new ways. Now, we looked at the timeline last time, and we saw that we were looking at a time period that goes from 12,000 years ago all the way up to as recently as 3,000 years ago. So we talked about how long of a period that is. Well, that's still the case here. So our Paleo-Indian group, we were looking around 12,000 years ago. Today, we're going to look at about 10,000 years ago, and that's where it begins. About 10,000 years ago, the archaic Indians lived in present-day Pennsylvania. Now, archaic. We talked last time with the Paleo-Indians about a paleontologist. Archaic, there's also a scientist called an archaeologist. So both study periods of time from long, long ago. Archaic Indians. Archaic means very old, very ancient, long, long ago. Archaic Indians lived in present-day Pennsylvania. The archaic Indians found new ways to use the area's rich land and resources. Like the Paleo Indians, so we have some similarities here. Like the Paleo Indians, the archaic Indians hunted animals and gathered plants, nuts, and berries for food. They also began to grow their own food. They grew sunflowers for seeds and gourds for containers. Now let's read that again. They also began to grow their own food. That was huge, okay? Learning to grow food was one of the great breakthroughs in human history, okay? One of the biggest discoveries in human history was the ability to grow food. Think about the effects that could have, okay? In fact, if we were together, I'd stop here and ask you to write about that. We'd be thinking, what are some of the effects? What are some things that could happen because people learn to grow their own food? Well, hopefully one of the things you're thinking is that they wouldn't have to move as much. They wouldn't have to spend as much time searching and hunting for food because now they can grow their own food. They're still going to need to hunt. They're still going to need to find food in the wild. But if you had a bad day hunting, it's not as big of a deal. It's not as devastating because you have other sources of food, because you have that ability to grow food yourself. So that was a huge, huge breakthrough. And it goes on to explain that here in our next two paragraphs. The archaic Indians spent less time moving around in search of food because they grew crops. There's that key word, because. So because they could grow crops, the effect is they spent less time moving around searching for food. Cause and effect. They were able to settle in small villages. So now if I'm moving around less, we talked about how the Paleo Indians lived in temporary shelters, things like caves or maybe a tent that they could carry with them. But now if I can start growing food and I don't have to move when the animals move, if I can kind of wait a little longer, well, that means I'm going to be able to stay in one place longer. And if I can stay in one place longer, maybe I can build a more permanent type of home. And if I can build a more permanent type of home, maybe I'm going to discover some new materials, some new methods, some new tools that I could invent to help me with that. So all of these things start to happen because of that one development, because of that ability to farm. Now, if we're going to be staying in one place and other people are going to be staying in that place, maybe we need to start to have some rules for our village. Maybe we need to start to have some leadership structures set up in place. So we start to see those kinds of things happening as well with societies starting to develop, cities and law, or not cities so much, but villages, laws. So we start to get these rules in place, and we start to see those things happening because humankind has learned this skill of growing their own food. Okay. Archaic Indians, it goes on, used spears, hammers, and fish hooks made from bone, shell, stone, and wood. They also made important discoveries. For example, they learned to use stones heated in fire to cook food. Now, if you've ever gone to a brick oven pizza shop, here in my town we have a place called Marzoni's, and depending on who's watching this, I know my students would be familiar with that. They're famously known as a brick oven pizza shop. Well, why is that? Because they heat the bricks, okay? So in that restaurant, they're heating the brick. They're heating the stone, basically. Brick is kind of like a man-made stone. So they're heating that and then using that heat to cook with. Well, that creates a more even heat. If you've ever tried to roast a hot dog over a campfire, it's really easy to burn part of it and have the other part still seem almost like it's raw. Or think about toasting a marshmallow. The same thing. You can burn the outside really easily and the inside's still hard. It doesn't get gooey yet. So cooking over a fire is one type of skill, but when they learned to use stones, well, the stones would hold the heat. They could put that all into a big pit and put the meat in there and it would roast the meat slowly. So learning to cook in a different way, and that way would be more effective. It would cook things a little more evenly and a little better. It says they also used stones to grind tools such as the axe. And I'm hoping, I haven't looked yet as I'm recording this, but I'm hoping I can find some videos that will show you kind of how those stone tools were made. The archaic Indians also created a tool called an atlatl. I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways. I've heard atlatl and I've heard atlatl. So depending on how you pronounce the A there, whether it's a or but the atlatl. And this tool allowed the archaic Indians to throw spears faster and farther. Now, this is one of the times I'm most upset that we're not together, because what I like to do in class, what we would do in class, is we would actually try out an atlatl. I have some that I've made, and they're not exactly like what the Native Americans would have used, not exactly like what these archaic Indians would have been hunting with, but it gives us the idea of how that worked. So I do have several videos I want to show you about that, and I'm going to have them all attached here as well. So check these out. It's a really neat invention when you think about this was 10,000 years ago that people figured this out. Pretty remarkable when you think about the kind of technology that they had available to them to come up with an idea like this. So there's a table here at the top of the page that talks a little more in depth about those three developments. So heated stones. It says stones heated in fires were used to boil water. The archaic people used the hot stones to roast meat in pits. Roasting the meat helped it last longer. So raw meat's going to spoil fairly quickly. Roasted meat or dried out, it removes some of the moisture, dries it out a little bit. Think about something like beef jerky that would last a long time. When it's roasted or when it's dried, it lasts a lot longer. So that would help preserve it when they didn't have any refrigeration or any way to store things. Stone axe. The archaic Indians used a stone axe to cut down trees. They also used stone axes to dig out the inside of trees to make canoes. Dugout canoes help people travel on rivers. So they would just take a tree and they would dig out the inside, hollow it out on the inside to make a canoe. Okay? And then finally, that atlatl. An atlatl was a tool that helped the archaic hunters throw their spears harder and faster. The atlatl allowed them to catch fast animals like deer. Now, why did they need to catch deer? Here's another cause and effect. Because the Ice Age ended and large, slower animals died out, people had to learn to hunt faster animals, so they invented a new tool like the atlatl. Okay, throwing a spear wouldn't be as effective. You had to get close. You had to be fairly quiet. You had to make sure the animal didn't pick up your scent. And you had to be able to throw it pretty hard. So with the atlatl, you were able to throw that spear harder and faster. You could stay further away. You could be very accurate with that tool from a greater distance. Atlatls were made from pieces of stone and wood. So we'll read about the woodland Indians here on the next page, and then I want you to check out some of those videos that I have with the atlatl and make sure you pay close attention to those. There's several different examples. There are still people that use the atlatl today, although often it's more as a hobby. We mentioned Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. They have an otlotl competition, I believe, every year. So the otlotl is still used today. There are some people that use it as a hunting tool or as a hunting weapon still, but it would be a very challenging weapon to go out and hunt with. Okay. So we're going to move to woodland Indians on page 13 as we finish this lesson up. Over time, American Indian groups changed. About 3,000 years ago, woodland Indian groups lived in Pennsylvania. Woodland Indians in Pennsylvania hunted animals and gathered some wild plants for food. They also grew their own food. They discovered new foods that had not been grown by the Paleo and Archaic Indians, such as corn and squash. They settled for long periods of time in order to grow and harvest crops. So the woodland Indians kind of continued the developments that the Archaic Indians had made and then advanced them even further by discovering new crops, new ways to live. And again, that was about 3,000 years ago. So we started 12,000 years ago with the Paleo Indians, moved up about 2,000 years, 10,000 years ago, we had the Archaic Indians. And just think about the difference, 2,000 years. If we go back 2,000 years from right now, we're like at the beginnings of civilization, really. We're in the ancient Roman Empire. It would be the year 20 as I'm recording this in 2020. So if we'd go back 2,000 years, that's kind of the time period we're looking at. So when we talk about 2,000 years between the Archaic Indians and the Paleo Indians, that's what we're talking about. And then 7,000 years from the Archaic Indians, from the time their society started up until the time we get to the woodland Indians, 3,000 years ago. So that's a really long time that we're looking at. Okay? Our lesson summary here says the first people in Pennsylvania lived thousands of years ago in a time called prehistory. Early peoples adapted their ways of life to changes in the environment. So that kind of wraps things up nicely. This was a time called prehistory, and those earliest people had to make their lives kind of revolve around and adapt around changes that occurred around them, whether it was the animals moving, whether it was their environment changing. Those types of things had a greater impact on their lives than what they would in our time. So they were very, very dependent on the on the world around them. Okay. Why it matters. It says American Indians were the first people to settle in Pennsylvania and to grow their own food. So pretty important time in history, pretty important developments, even though we don't really think about technology when we're talking about a time that's at the very least 3,000 years ago. But there were some big breakthroughs taking place at that time, some big advancements occurring. So that's kind of where this is going. Okay? In our next section, we're going to be looking more closely at these Eastern Woodland Indian tribes and the different groups of Eastern Woodland Indians that lived here. So we can look forward to that next time. Check out those Atlatl videos that I have posted. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.